Back in high school and in my first few years of college, my primary drive in life was to own the atheists. I spent hours watching debates between Christian apologists and atheists and arguing in the comments sections. As a young Christian, I came across many challenges to Christianity and developed ways to deal with various arguments. What couldn't be faulted was my passion. I hope that some good came from that, which from my point of view would be at least one or a few people reconsidering their position on Christianity. In the years since, I've come to distance myself from apologetics, perhaps even swinging too far the other way for a bit. I first noticed that while I was engaged in comment section wars, I was more concerned with finding ways to prove God exists to the atheists, who most likely weren't going to be convinced anyways, than relating to the God I was fighting for. So I took a strong turn away from apologetics and more toward theology in my latter years of college. But in both of these phases of my life, I have to admit there was a strong sense of pride in the group that I associated myself with. First, I felt I was one of the logical Christians. Then after that, I was a theologically sound Christian. But in both phases, honestly, I spoke what I believed to be the truth, with a degree of harshness. I would oppose false doctrines with the certainty that it was my duty to correct everyone. Now as I revisit apologetics a bit, and as I look back into the arguments I used to make, I don't find them as convincing anymore. But not necessarily because the arguments themselves are that bad. For example, let's take the fine-tuning argument, and the variety of cosmological arguments, or causal arguments. The most popular these days, as far as I can tell, is the Kalam cosmological argument, which was formulated by a Muslim, but in the Western world it's most popularly used by William Lane Craig. The fine-tuning argument is never really used as a smoking gun argument, which definitively proves that God exists, but instead suggests that, due to the absolute precision present in the beginning of the universe, it's better to believe in God. As for the Kalam, it goes, all things that begin to exist have a cause, and since the universe began to exist, there is a cause, which various other reasons will be given for, as to why that cause is God. To prove premise 2 of the universe beginning to exist appeals to science as well as the logical impossibility of an eternal past and infinite regress of causes are used. I take issue with the reactions of some of the more militant atheists in response to this, as they tend to follow the line of thinking that if they aren't personally convinced, the argument itself is not solid. Again, the fine-tuning argument was never really used as if it were undeniable proof of God, so it's hard to really argue with it. But as for the Kalam argument, though I myself no longer really find it convincing, that doesn't mean that the argument itself doesn't at least give people sufficient reason to be convinced that God exists. It doesn't need to convince every single individual to be a decent argument. And just because it's a logically sound argument, doesn't mean it needs to convince everyone. But the true toxicity of this debate begins when an atheist will challenge a young Christian who might be seeing such ideas for the first time and try to push them out of the Christian faith immediately after just one challenge, or when, perhaps after owning the atheist, the Christians gloat and proclaim the idiocy of atheism. We're too concerned with winning debates and crusading for our beliefs and not enough with our shared humanity and the pursuit of truth. We have to recognize that being found lost for words in response doesn't mean that we have to change our beliefs. Regardless, I don't think this is generally where people are convinced of the existence of God or his non-existence. Truthfully, from just asking if logically God exists, it's easy to believe in God, but it's also easy to believe there is no God, which I will elaborate on a little bit more later in this video. I believe that we're one step closer to the core of belief when moral arguments are assessed. William Lane Craig also helped popularize a version of the moral argument, which essentially appeals to what to us seems to be the definitive reality of morality, and the need for a personal moral lawgiver, for moral truths to be more than just an illusory experience. Another way that the moral argument has been used is when debating sensitive moral topics, in which traditionally Christians might find themselves opposing the secular crowd on. You will often see the atheist declare that God doesn't exist and so biblical morality doesn't need to be followed, while the Christian will usually demand that the atheist give the foundation for their morality. I have often applied the moral argument in such a way as well. This situation is particularly messy and has many layers to it, but first I'm going to take a quick dig at the atheists on this one. If you're going to declare that God doesn't exist, and thus we don't need to obey biblical morality, when a Christian then begins to give, perhaps, cosmological arguments for God's existence, reverting to your moral disagreements with the Bible is a rather insincere way of arguing. And if you're going to say that God is a moral monster for one event listed in the Bible, then the Christian gives additional context with another related event from the Bible, but then you call this additional event a myth. I hope I don't have to point out the logical mess that has just been created. Those are true scenarios I've encountered, which I'll revisit later in this video. But in response to the Christian applying the moral argument to these sensitive topics, you'll often hear atheists say something along the lines of, "I don't need God to tell me how to be good." Theologically and in the matter of sin, there are many issues with this, and I get that. But it would do us all a world of good if we tried to see the merit in the opposing argument. See, what's happening now is that both individuals are talking at each other. They're coming at it from completely different foundational narratives. It's a bit hard to describe with words, but I'll try my best. The atheist in this case sees themselves as doing a preferable good simply because it means that we as humans benefit from the moral contracts we're forming. The basis of morality is simply that we're human, and it doesn't take what the atheist perceives to be an old and perhaps outdated book to instruct them on human decency. And honestly, there is a very strong power to the subjectivity of this stance, and inspiration to the mere human will to strive for something better. Perhaps there's no divine foundation for the moral law that we are given, but that's okay, and that emphasizes the preciousness of being human. Not that Christianity doesn't emphasize the same, but simply that they both do in their own separate ways. Meanwhile, the Christian believes that there is an eternal code of moral truth that transcends the trends of today, that people should obey because it is, ultimately, truth, whether it be 1,000 years ago today, or 1,000 years in the future. A good society is one that will adhere to these truths, and this truth isn't updated by new technology, new fashion, new scientific excuses, and they are excuses, as natural doesn't mean good. But my description of atheistic morality is why I take issue with this application of the moral argument as well, because if we truly believe that this morality exists, then our goal in regards to ethics is a wider sense of morality. Morality is already present, and we shouldn't dismiss the efforts of the atheists, who are also striving toward a moral standard. Even if we as Christians are right, it feels like we're pulling a trick to win our arguments, instead of meeting non-believers in a productive dialogue. When Christians and the non-religious clash, it's filled with shouting, gloating, and insulting. When I opened this video with a brief summary of my own experiences with apologetics and owning the atheists, that story demonstrated a reality about the process of debating this topic itself. There are some challenges made by atheists, including the goodness of hell existing or the problem of evil and suffering, and where that even originates from, which are typically viewed as more mature challenges to Christianity than perhaps the rock problem. But I wouldn't say that's a really definitive of what a mature challenge is. But the rock problem itself, though I personally don't think it needs to be taken very seriously for reasons I won't give in this video, has the same takeaway as the origin of evil, as well as the existence of hell. There are perfectly reasonable answers to be given to these questions, but that doesn't mean that they are perfectly acceptable answers to everyone. And at the same time, again, just because you aren't convinced or you don't accept an answer, doesn't mean that it's a bad answer. For example, in response to the problem of evil, or the argument of evil, which is more logically formulated, William Lane Craig simply dismisses this by saying, and adding to the argument, that God could have morally sufficient reasons for permitting evil in this world. And while many Christian apologists will give their various reasons why they believe God permits evil and suffering, one such answer would be a free will defense. But does everyone have to accept the answer? Obviously not. I think it's fair to say that, at least, it gives sufficient reason for someone to believe God can be morally good, as well as omnipotent and omniscient, but still permit evil. Belief is a very human matter. Logic might play a part, but ultimately, this is a human struggle. You're not likely to convince someone that their foundational worldview is wrong with just one debate, and so it's useless to try to pressure someone to to convert or deconvert. Faith is something that someone will be convicted of over the course of their life, and so it's useless to shout or to insult and overlook our shared humanity. Also, just because I said it's useless, I'm not saying we can't shout at each other or insult each other, although it's definitely not preferable, because that too is also a very human behavior. But I just want to emphasize that this is something to keep in mind when we're discussing this topic. Over the course of our lives, we will have had different experiences in different states of mind, and we will respond to answers that are given to us or questions that are posed to us differently. I believe that's the proper role of apologetics, not to offer answers that we must stick to, hide behind, and parrot just so that we can pretend we're rationally justified in our faith, but to seek, to question, and to answer if we can, and give reasoning to try to connect to other people. Each question you come across, and each answer you give or are given, you on an individual level will find conviction for throughout the course of your life. But even if you are not convicted, it's okay to not need to answer everything, or to be capable of defending every facet of your faith, to still have faith. But I also want to stress that if we really want productive dialogue, we can't just think with one mindset, such as when Christians will throw Bible verses at atheists as if that proves to the atheists that they're wrong. The truth of a Bible verse might seem obvious to us Christians, but that's not the foundation of a productive dialogue. We need sincerity in the way that we approach each other, and in our understanding of our own hearts and our own intentions. We should also not underestimate how large the commitment of faith is, both in the external matters of how you live your life, as well as the internal person. As Christians, we believe God, though there will be people who aren't saved, desires for all to be saved, and takes no pleasure in seeing anyone perish. How we deal with the weight of that is simply a matter of faith in the sovereignty of God, as well as your various theological stances. It needs no more justification, though people have tried, and are definitely not wrong to attempt to rationalize it. When these factors of the sheer commitment required to become a Christian, at least a faithful Christian, as well as the fact that we are not to take pleasure in the condemnation of any, are accounted for, we need to see the human weight of this, above the intellect, or above winning. It does no good to argue with intellectual pride apart from a compassion for humanity, as many do when wielding the typical arguments of Christian apologetics. Ironically, we often act more boastful than people who don't believe boasting to be sin. And to be fair, atheists too can overlook the human aspect in their rhetoric and in various social situations. We can't have an honest dialogue when we merely attempt to push back against beliefs we don't agree with, and forget our shared humanity, as well as the merits of what we might call the other side.